If you're a fan of cars from the 50s, 60s, and even through the 1970s, one of the things that you likely enjoy about some of the models is the hardtop design, as you can see here on my 1968 Mercury Park Lane Brougham. The hardtops were vehicles that didn't have a B-pillar. As you can see with the windows down, there's nothing in the middle there, aside from the doors and then, of course, a post to provide structural integrity for the doors, but no B-pillar between the windows. The idea of the hardtop design was a couple things. One, to kind of give buyers a feeling of being inside a convertible. So you could have all the windows down with no pillars on the sides, a little bit lower roof line as well to have it be a more sporty vehicle. And in general, just have a better looking car than a car that had those pillars and taller roof lines. But where did the hardtop start? Well, that's a debate. As you can see here, in 1946, Chrysler actually had a vehicle that was called the Town and Country Club Coupe, and it met all the definitions that I mentioned of a hardtop. It had the convertible's roof line. Basically, it was a convertible with a hardtop over top of a 6-passenger convertible, including that lower windshield and shorter A-pillars, and obviously no B-pillar. So why is this particular vehicle often not credited with being the first hardtop that was produced? Well, for a number of reasons. The first is that allegedly only 7 were produced, of which 1 perhaps survives today. So there just really weren't many that were produced, and Chrysler, for whatever reason, I guess had a bit of a timid heart when it came to producing this particular variant. It had the convertible, it had the sedan, had all the makings of initiating a new styling trend, but just really shied away from it at the last minute and didn't produce much of anything. Now, in the world of four-door hardtops, some will credit the 1949 Kaiser Virginian that you see here as the first four-door hardtop because it really doesn't have a B-pillar. It kind of has a see-through B-pillar, and the front and back glass go down. I don't know if this is really a four-door hardtop or not. To me, a four-door hardtop is a car that truly doesn't have a B-pillar, and this one, like I said, has a see-through B-pillar. So it's part of the way there, but it did meet some of the other definitions with the lower roof line, and effectively it had a stamped piece of metal over top of a convertible body. So it meets some of the definitions of a hardtop, but it's not all the way there. By the way, this is one of the reasons why in some nomenclature you hear of hardtops as being described as hardtop convertibles, because that's how they started. It really was a stamped steel panel over top of a convertible body. And as time went on, the convertible piece just dropped because, well, clearly there was no way to put the, let's say, top down. It was a bit of an oxymoron, a hardtop convertible. And I think that's why after a few years and into the later 1950s, nobody quite called it that anymore. However, 1949 is really the year that the hardtop craze truly began when General Motors introduced a trio of hardtop coupes. Interestingly, as I mentioned, that these were all two-door vehicles. The hardtop craze really started with the two doors. Four-door hardtops would not be a thing until 1955 when General Motors would introduce those to the public, so long as you don't count, as I mentioned, the 1949 Kaiser Virginian as a four-door hardtop. But there were 3 two-door hardtops that GM introduced for 1949. The 1949 Cadillac Coupe de Ville that you see here, the 1949 Buick Roadmaster Riviera, and the 1949 Oldsmobile 98 Holiday Hardtop Coupe. Each of these 3 vehicles, though they didn't necessarily sell well in the inaugural year, is really credited with starting the hardtop craze. And it would take other automakers a number of years before they would introduce their hardtops. Ford was probably the slowest to market with theirs. Regardless, these 3 vehicles from General Motors are often credited as the first mass-produced hardtops. One could go back to the teens era or the 20s and find some custom-bodied vehicles or vehicles that had removable glass that would not have a B-pillar. But these really were the first. And although they didn't sell very well, they certainly sold better than the Kaiser Virginian. The Coupe de Ville and the Riviera and the Olds 98 Holiday Hardtop Coupe also between 2 and a little over 4,000 units in 1949, in part because they were available for only a portion of the model year. GM further expanded the two-door hardtop lineup in 1950 when it allowed Chevrolet to have its own two-door hardtop, the Bel Air, named after the ritzy-ditzy neighborhood in the Los Angeles area of California. But the two-door hardtop on the Bel Air, many people know the 1955 6.7 Chevrolet Bel Air, but that name was introduced in 1950 specifically for the hardtop coupe that you see here to distinguish it from the Fleet Line series of Chevrolets, as well as the Style Line series of Chevrolets. And although I'm not a big fan of early 1950s era car design in general, I think these Chevrolets are actually pretty good-looking cars. And then in 1950, it was really off to the races with some of the other automakers, Chrysler in particular, which introduced a number of hardtops across this lineup, including this beautiful DeSoto Sportsman hardtop coupe that was quite distinctive for the era, and then the Chrysler Town & Country Newport hardtop coupe as well, with its real wood sides. Dodge would also enter this hardtop craze in 1950 with the Coronet Diplomat hardtop coupe that you see here. It would take Plymouth until 1951 to offer its hardtop, the Belvedere hardtop coupe that you see here. And 1951 was also the year, partway through the model year, that Ford would introduce the hardtop finally on its Victoria line. And I think one of the reasons why Ford took so long was because the 1949 shoebox Fords were really not engineered from the get-go to be hardtops. And you can imagine if you don't engineer the car for removal of a B-pillar, well, it's pretty tough to do that after the fact. So it took all the way through till 1951, partway through that model year for Ford to offer its first hardtop. And then Lincoln and Mercury would not offer hardtops until 1952. So Ford, I think, also was capital constrained during this time frame and just didn't have the money to offer the hardtops, especially in response to what General Motors was doing. And if we're honest, the GM hardtops in the first years that they were sold weren't all that great of sellers, and so Ford was probably waiting to see if they would catch on in the market, and indeed they did. Over at some of the independents, Packard didn't introduce a hardtop all the way until 1954 with this Clipper Panama two-door that you see here. And this, coupled with Packard's reticence to introduce an overhead valve V8 engine, probably hastened its demise. Imagine you were driving a very expensive car, for example, in 1950. You could get a Cadillac with the hardtop styling if you wanted by that point, an overhead valve V8 engine. Packard, you were still getting its lazy, I'll call it straight 8 engine all the way up through the 1954 model year before in 1955 it would finally introduce the overhead valve V8 engine. At least in 1954, if you got a Packard, you got the largest mass production straight 8 engine in an American car, the 359 cubic inch Thunderbolt straight 8 engine. So, well, there was that, but customers generally wanted the overhead valve V8 by that point. Over at Studebaker, it would take until 1952 for them to introduce the Commander Starliner hardtop coupe. But really, Studebakers in 1952 weren't known for their styling. The 1953 Starliner coupe was really the styling icon, perhaps of the entire decade in the 1950s, and was so trendsetting, not only with the hardtop styling, which by this point was several model years old, but really with that extremely low cowl, low hood, tapered front, tapered rear, twin port grille, beautiful proportions with the coupe on a longer wheelbase than even the four-door sedan from Studebaker in 1953. The car was just spectacular and set the design world ablaze. Think of it as the 1986 Taurus of the time. In fact, probably even far more radical than the 1986 Taurus was in 1986, because there were other European vehicles like the Audis that really inspired the Ford design. But the Studebaker was a complete original for 1953, done by Raymond Loewy and his team. And it remains one of the most beautiful cars I think ever produced to this day. So the hardtop craze was in full swing by the early 1950s, but really it had just applied to two-doors, as you saw. Although it was proliferating across the lineup for many automakers, there were not yet four-door hardtops, really my favorite, or one of my favorite body styles. That would stop in 1955 when General Motors would introduce the four-door hardtop to the world. Now, you could get four-door hardtops on some select GM models for 1955, but by 1956, it really spread to the entire General Motors lineup, all the way down to Chevrolet as well. And that was really the year that now you had two-door and four-door hardtops offered by many, many different automakers. Of course, while Ford was late to the overall hardtop craze, they did have one super cool hardtop that nobody else really did. Remember, I told you that it was often called a hardtop convertible. Well, Ford had the Skyliner, the 1957 Skyliner, introduced a true hardtop convertible to the buying public, where the entire top was made of metal and it was removable and went into the trunk. You basically had this little box section that you could put your luggage in the trunk that wouldn't get crushed when the hardtop was lowered. But otherwise, you obviously couldn't use the trunk volume because it stowed the entire roof. But Ford did have that interesting feature that it pioneered for the buying public. And of course, there were some hardtop wagons for a number of years. And Chrysler was the last to produce those hardtop wagons in the 1960s. More specifically, 1964 was the last year for any hardtop station wagon. You can see the Chrysler variant here. What a handsome wagon design. It's kind of a shame that after this, station wagons weren't offered in the hardtop body style. But Chrysler kept on with it all the way through 1964, later than GM as well as Ford. And while the wagon hardtop body style would die out after 1964, hardtops, including four-door hardtops, really continued for a number of years after that. But the four-door hardtop body style was dead after 1974 at Ford. You can see my 1974 Mercury Marquis Brougham hardtop, one of only 4,000-ish made in 1974. This was the last year for the four-door hardtop at the Ford Motor Company on the full-size cars. At General Motors, the last year for the four-door hardtop was 1976. And then at Chrysler, the last year, just like the wagon that they held on the longest, at Chrysler, the last year for the four-door hardtop was 1978. And so by the late 1970s, the hardtop craze was over. It lasted for, well, almost, let's say, 30 years, pretty close. And I think it's a shame. There was a number of reasons why it stopped. One of which was that there were impending rollover standards, and it was very hard to meet rollover standards with no B-pillar. And that's one of the reasons why convertibles were not produced for a number of years. Cadillac had the so-called last convertible in 1976 with its El Dorado, before it being reintroduced a few years later when those rollover standards were never enacted. And beyond that, I think a lot of people, once air conditioning came in to play, enjoyed the enhanced structural rigidity of the cars with the B-pillar. You didn't have to put the windows down as much, and the cars were a little bit tauter and rode a little better, had a few less rattles, less wind noise, and I think that's really what ended up dooming the hardtop. There still are some cars today that are hardtops, but they're very expensive, and it's certainly not something that you see on mass-produced vehicles, really because of crash standards and rollover standards, like I mentioned. So what's your favorite hardtop design? It's kind of tough for me to pick. I have to admittedly state, when it comes to the coupes, I love the fastback coupes, particularly the GM ones of the mid-1960s. I think they're all fantastic. There's not a bad-looking one. I have to say I'm a bit partial to Pontiac and my 1965 Iris Mist Bonneville that you see here. Not Irish Mist, Iris Mist. That's why it's violet colored, or silver with a drop of violet added to it. And it really doesn't matter if you have a two-door or four-door 1965 Pontiac hardtop. As you can see here, they both are gorgeous designs. And I think that was true pretty much of every single General Motors car for 1965. So you pick your 1965, 6, 7 General Motors car, pretty much any of them. Those have to be some of my favorites. Now, I have to say, there's some Chryslers that are my favorites as well as Fords, but I think that these are probably my favorite of all time. And of course, the 66 Tornado is an example, along with the Riviera and El Dorado. Those, in terms of hardtop coupes, I think are perfection as well. But put a comment in the comment section and let me know what is your favorite hardtop of all time. Thanks again for watching.